1,500 kilometers. That's how far a fuel refinery sat from the Ukrainian border when it reportedly went up in flames this week, one of the deepest strikes of the entire war. According to Defense Express, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, hit a major Lukoil-linked refinery so far into Russian territory that, until recently, planners in Moscow would have written it off as safe. How they pulled it off is one question. What a target that far from the front line says about where this war is heading is the more interesting one. Stay with this, because the distance is only the headline. The real story is what this refinery was for, why it took Ukraine roughly 2 years of trial and error to reach targets this deep, and what analysts think it means for the rest of 2026. We're not going to speculate about how the strike was carried out. That's not what this channel does. We're going to walk through what's confirmed, what's still murky, and why a burning refinery 1,000 miles from the trenches matters as much as anything happening on the ground. Here's what's known so far. Defense Express, an independent Ukrainian defense-focused outlet that has tracked this campaign closely since it began, reported that the SBU struck a refinery tied to Lukoil, one of Russia's largest oil companies, roughly 1,500 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. If that figure holds up, this would rank among the farthest confirmed hits of the war, well past most of the refinery strikes reported over the last 2 years, which mostly landed in the 300 to 900 kilometer range. Kiev's stated reasoning, consistent with earlier strikes in this campaign, is simple. Refineries turn crude oil into the diesel, jet fuel, and other products that keep both the Russian military and the wider economy running. Damage a refinery and you damage the machine sustaining the war, not just the front line itself. A quick word on Lukoil, since the name comes up a lot here. It's one of Russia's largest oil companies, a major producer and refiner with operations across multiple regions. Its refineries, like those run by its state-linked competitors, feed both domestic fuel supply and export markets. None of that is secret information. It's the kind of background you'd find in any energy sector primer. What's changed is that a facility connected to a company this size, sitting this far from any front line, is now apparently a viable target. What we don't have yet, and this matters, is a verified read on how much damage was actually done. Reports out of the region describe a fire and, in some cases, secondary explosions, but the scale of the disruption is, for now, claimed rather than independently confirmed. Ukrainian officials tend to describe these strikes in maximalist terms right after they happen, while Russian officials and Lukoil, when they say anything, tend to play the impact down. Neither side is neutral here, and satellite imagery, the most reliable way to verify damage at other refineries hit in this campaign, usually takes days to surface publicly. So treat any specific percentage of lost capacity or barrels per day taken offline as unconfirmed, no matter what number you see floating around elsewhere. I went back through Defense Express's prior reporting on this campaign before writing this, because one detail kept nagging at me. Almost every strike in 2024 and 2025 landed inside what you'd call medium range for a one-way drone, inside 1,000 kilometers. This one reportedly didn't. That's not a small technical footnote. It suggests the toolkit itself has changed, even if we don't know exactly how. Worth remembering that this campaign didn't start at 1,500 kilometers. Early strikes in this pattern, back in 2024, reportedly struggled to reliably reach even a few hundred kilometers past the border, and a good share of attempted strikes were intercepted or missed entirely, according to Russian and Ukrainian reporting at the time. Getting from occasional, unreliable hits near the border to a confirmed strike deep in Russian territory took roughly 2 years of incremental, mostly unpublicized improvement, the kind of slow technical grind that rarely makes headlines on its own, though this week's strike is the visible result of it. So why does distance matter so much here? Because distance is, quite literally, the main thing keeping most of Russia's oil infrastructure out of reach. Russia's air defense network is dense and layered, but it isn't infinite. It's concentrated most heavily around the capital, around key military installations, and along the areas closest to the front. A facility 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine sits far outside the zones that have historically gotten the thickest protection, on the assumption that distance itself was a form of defense. We won't get into the specific technical means by which a strike at that range would be carried out, that crosses into operational detail this channel deliberately avoids. But in general terms, any weapon capable of reliably reaching that far forces a defender to either thin out protection somewhere else to cover a much bigger perimeter, or accept that part of the country simply isn't realistically defensible against every possible axis of attack. That's the structural problem a strike like this is apparently designed to expose, whether or not this particular refinery ends up seriously damaged. Most people assume a refinery 1,000 miles from the fighting is basically immune to it. That assumption held up reasonably well through the first 2 years of the full-scale war. It hasn't held up well since, and this strike, if the distance holds up under scrutiny, is the clearest illustration yet of how much has changed. For a while, this looked like a story about one refinery and one fire. It isn't. It's a story about a pattern that's been building for 2 years, and the pattern is what should actually worry planners in Moscow. Since roughly the start of 2024, Ukraine has run a sustained campaign of long-range strikes against Russian oil refineries, storage depots, and fuel logistics hubs. Facilities in Ryazan, Volgograd, Novokuybishevsk, and Syzran, among others, have been hit at various points, some more than once, according to reporting from Defense Express and other outlets tracking the campaign, including Reuters and the Institute for the Study of War. Estimates of the campaign's cumulative effect on Russian refining capacity have varied widely and shifted over time, with some analysts pointing to stretches of double-digit disruption to refining throughput and others noting that Russian repair crews have gotten damaged units back online faster than expected. Both things can be true at once. Individual strikes cause real, if often temporary, disruption, while the overall Russian refining sector has so far avoided a systemic collapse. This latest strike, if the 500-kilometer figure is accurate, extends that campaign's reach rather than marking some entirely new kind of operation. There's a financial angle here, too, worth stating plainly because it's easy to lose under all the talk of fires and drones. Refined fuel is also an export good. Russia has historically sold diesel and other refined products abroad for real revenue, some of which has already been squeezed by sanctions the United States, the European Union, and other governments have imposed since 2022. Every refinery forced offline, even temporarily, means lost domestic supply, lost export revenue, or both, and repairs aren't free. That's the slower, less cinematic half of what this campaign is squeezing, alongside the more visible question of fuel for military vehicles and aircraft. Here's an unpopular take, and we'll just say it. The debate over whether this campaign works is often framed the wrong way. Some point out, correctly, that Russia hasn't run out of fuel and its military has kept fighting. Others point out, also correctly, that refineries have been repeatedly forced offline, repair costs have piled up, and Russia has had to import some refined products it would normally export. Judging this campaign on whether it lands a single knockout blow misses what it's actually built to do: grind down margins, capacity, and export revenue over years, not weeks. Whether that's the best use of scarce long-range strike capability compared to hitting purely military targets is a real, open argument, and reasonable analysts land on different sides of it. So here's the layer most coverage of this strike will skip. It isn't really about this one refinery. It's about what happens to a country's defensive calculus once no facility can be assumed safe just because it's far away. That's the question worth sitting with for the rest of this video. What do you think? Does a campaign like this meaningfully shorten the war by squeezing the resources behind it? Or is it mostly a costly way to generate headlines without changing the fundamental math on the battlefield? We genuinely don't think the answer is obvious, and we'd rather hear where you land than pretend we've settled it. There's a line buried in Defense Express's own earlier coverage of this campaign that's stuck with me since I first read it months ago. Something to the effect that Russian air defense doctrine was, for a long time, built around the idea that a small number of high-value strategic targets needed the heaviest protection, while the rest of the country's industrial base could rely on distance and dispersal. A strike 1,500 kilometers deep is exactly the kind of event that assumption wasn't built to survive. What strikes us about this case isn't really the fire itself, it's what it says about how modern wars actually get decided. For most of the 20th century, distance from the front line was one of the most reliable forms of protection an industrial target could have. That's stopped being reliably true in this war, and not just for Russia. Long-range strike capability, once the province of a handful of major powers, is increasingly something a determined, resourceful state can build up over a couple of years without needing a superpower's budget. That shift will outlast this particular conflict, whichever way it ends. The refinery is burning, or it was, depending on when the fire got brought under control. Reporting on that detail is still filtering out. But the more interesting fire, in a sense, is the one this strike lights under everyone trying to model how the rest of 2026 plays out. Where does this actually stand right now? Confirmed. A Lukoil-linked refinery was struck, Defense Express reported it, and the SBU's involvement was cited in that reporting. Consistent with 2 years of pattern, this fits Ukraine's broader long-range strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure. Unconfirmed. The exact extent of physical damage, the specific effect on the refinery's output or on Lukoil's wider operations, and the precise distance figure pending independent verification. 1,500 kilometers is the reported number, and we're treating it as reported, not as an independently geolocated fact, because that kind of confirmation usually takes satellite analysts several days to a couple of weeks to nail down with confidence. If you see a specific damage percentage or barrel count attached to this strike elsewhere, be skeptical until it's attributed to a named, credible source. Analysts who study this campaign generally read strikes like this one as evidence that Ukraine's long-range strike programs have matured. Longer range, better navigation and evasion, improved targeting over the roughly 18 months since the campaign against refineries began in earnest. What that means for the second half of 2026 is genuinely contested. Some expect the pace and depth of these strikes to keep increasing as Ukraine's domestic production scales up. Others expect Russian air defense to adapt, as it has before, closing at least part of the gap strikes like this one are currently exploiting. Nobody watching this closely is claiming certainty either way, and you should be skeptical of anyone who tells you they know exactly how this ends. What's most surprising, if you've followed this campaign closely, isn't that a strike like this happened. It's that it took until mid-2026 for a confirmed hit at this distance to show up in reporting at all. Given how quickly the reach of these campaigns expanded between 2024 and 2025, several analysts had already flagged 1,000+ kilometer strikes as a when, not if, for over a year. That the actual milestone still generated this much attention says something about the gap between what specialists expect and what actually becomes public and confirmed. Put yourself for a second in the position of an air defense planner in Moscow this week. You've spent 2 years assuming a certain radius around the front line needed your densest coverage. Now a target more than 4 times that radius away has reportedly been hit. Do you thin out protection elsewhere to cover more ground, knowing you can't protect everything equally? Or do you accept that part of your industrial base is now, functionally, in play? There's no clean answer, and that's exactly the bind this strike seems designed to create. So where does that leave us? A refinery reportedly burned 1,500 kilometers inside Russia, tied to one of the country's largest oil companies, reportedly struck by Ukraine's security service. The precise damage is still unverified, and it'll likely take independent satellite analysis over the coming days to know how serious the disruption really is. Harder to dispute is the pattern this strike extends. 2 years of Ukraine pushing the effective range of its strikes against Russian energy infrastructure further from the front line, and a Russian air defense system built for a war that increasingly doesn't match the one it's now being asked to fight. We didn't have room in this video to get into how Russian refiners have historically repaired and restarted damaged units, sometimes in weeks, sometimes in months, and how that repair timeline is arguably the real number to watch, more than any single strike. Drop a comment if that's a video you'd want next, because it might be the more important half of this story. For now, treat this as one data point in a 2-year pattern, not a war-ending event on its own, and treat any dramatic damage claims you see about this specific refinery, in either direction, with the same caution we've applied throughout this video, reported until it's verified.